did we go from this to this to this? Hey everyone, it's Ron from Maxfield's Dream Antique Company, and this is part 2 of my beginner's guide to becoming a happy and successful antiques dealer. So part 2 is about understanding historical art and design movements, right? So Victorian, Edwardian, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, arts and crafts, which we're not going to talk too much about today. And we're going to use the example of Art Nouveau. So how did it come about? What happened to it? And this is a way to help you understand what makes a style unique, how and why it's different than other styles and other periods, and what history and historical events might have to do with it. So we'll talk about that. And as always, I encourage you to think about, what you're selling or buying in terms of the stories around it, the people, historical events, things like that. But that's for another time. The main thing to keep in mind that every art and design period is a reaction to the previous period. So there's something people don't want to do anymore. They don't want to see anymore. And we're going to talk about that in terms of Art Nouveau. Because when a new movement starts, like the old movement dies off because it's considered now old-fashioned and not hip, cool, whatever. So Art Nouveau, generally considered about 1890s to 1914, and there's a reason why the 1914 end date is that. Now, how did it come about? What you need to do is just Google Victorian interiors and take a look at what Victorian interiors. I have just a couple pieces to show. I showed this one. So Victorian style ended up from about 1830s to about 1890s. Lots of opulence, lots of detail, flowers, fruits, whatever. Right, so this would not have been considered over the top. This is a mid-19th century candlestick part of a Girandole set that I have. So I also have an example of fabric from that time. This is a 19th century French fabric, right? So, flowery, just lots of pattern there. Opulence, and at some point, it's feeling kind of fussy to some people, right? So, but what happens in 1853 is the United States sends a fleet to Japan. Now, Japan has been isolationist for 200 years at that point, right? Mid-18th century. They're not even letting their people leave the country. They don't want to deal with any foreigners. If they're going to deal with some foreigners around trade, the foreigners have to stay on an island. The United States, wants them to open up to trade. So the way they decided to do it was to send a fleet and then have representatives go aboard, but clearly making a show of force. So eventually, Japan decides to kind of just go with it because they really can't defeat the military might of the United States or Western powers in general, which China had to deal with also, and they knew what China had been dealing with for the prior 100 years. So trade starts. Now, as Japan opens up, people in the West start to see Japanese style, Japanese art, antiques, whatever, and they really like it. Let me give you an example. So here's a Meiji period bronze. So, maybe late 19th century, circa 1900, it's really not fussy. You see the sort of simple lines here, right? And they like it a lot. So it ends up becoming known as Japonism. Okay, in the 1870s or so. And you also see the birth of what's called the aesthetic movement. And I have an aesthetic movement piece here to show you. This is, I forget the date on this, 1870s, 1880s. You see that? So very simplistic. So people are thinking, yeah, we're done with that fussiness, yay, right? Let's do these very elegant, spare, beautiful, simple designs. So the French and the Belgians, to some extent, take it a little further, and they start to design things that are flowy but not fussy, organic lines. So like this, right? Very organic, flowing, but not overly fussy. And I'm going to give you another example here. And this is beautiful candelabra. Do you see the way the curves go? That there's no right angles in Art Nouveau. So those are just a couple examples of the Art Nouveau. Now, this all goes on, very popular, lots of things designed in Art Nouveau style until 1914. And by a weird historical chance that I'm not going to talk about today, but what happens is World War I starts. Now, this is considered the first real modern war, right? So there's the role of machines, airplanes, and in addition to that, 4 years of horror. So what happens is people get kind of entranced with machines. They're a little bit done with anything flowery, seems old-fashioned now after, the World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars, supposedly, right? People kind of horrified, but they become entranced with things that are streamlined and machine-like, right? Airplanes have to be streamlined. Racing cars have to be streamlined. And people start to like things made without the flowy organic stuff. And that's when you end up with things like this. This is a Weeping Woman piece from a barware set, right? Very machine-like, right? Very streamlined. I'm going to show you. This is one of two Art Deco bookends I have. You see how things shifted? They weren't, and anything flowery is considered old-fashioned because people like this now. All right. That's pure Art Deco, and this piece also, right? Very streamlined. There's nothing flowy or organic other than the streamline. So sometimes some of the stuff can be a little hard to tell. But people are done with Art Nouveau. And Art Nouveau still considered a beautiful time period, but your grandmother's time period, old-fashioned. It does come back in the 1960s. If you look at a lot of the rock posters, that's all Art Nouveau style. And you see I have a reproduction of we'll call it a reproduction of Art Nouveau. It's meant to look like Art Nouveau Mira with some design on top of it. So anyway, I think what I want to emphasize here is just, know why things started and ended, and you start to be able to remember them more, recognize certain pieces, maybe recognize fakes too, or reproductions that really weren't done at the time. But I hope that's helpful and informative. We'll see you soon.